Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Again, my name is David Garcia. I want to just start off with thanking Rira for organizing this event and the staff at Vroman's. I also want to thank and congratulate my friend and colleague, Dr. Eddie R. Cole, on his new book, The Campus Color Line. If you don't have it, you need to get it. Eddie, I thoroughly enjoyed your book. You make some very good interventions and you're pushing the scholarship forward. So congratulations to you on this very remarkable book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Do you want to get right into the questions or did you want to say a few things before?
I mean, as always, I love to thank the participants for tuning in to join us virtually. And I thank you, Dr. Garcia, for making time to read my book, engage me, and have this conversation live. It's always a pleasure. Not the format we usually talk, but I definitely look forward to this tonight.
Okay. Thank you. A quick shout out to Professor Tara J. Yossel's educational leadership class. I know you're here and you're joining us, all 75, I hope. So thank you for tuning in. Gotta remember to say that.
All right.
So we'll start with our first question for you. And you write in your book that the idea for this book is a natural extension of your own Black educational genealogy. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you can pick up on that, and can you tell us a little bit more of the story of the book? What are the origins and inspiration for this study?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. Appreciate you asking and getting right into it. This book is a product of the Black South, right? The Black U.S. South. I'm from Bowling, Alabama, which is located in West Central Alabama, Greene County. And so just how I think about the book, how I think about Black educational history is a part of my own family history that really pushed me in thinking about this. My parents were, rural West Alabama school teachers for 30 years each in the Greene and Sumter County school systems. My father's parents were also school teachers that started their careers in the 1-room, 2-room schoolhouses that we think about through the 1930s and 40s. And so coming from a generation, multiple generations of teachers, I'd always been thinking about the role of Black teachers, being members of Black teachers associations and what that means for education. So even though formal Jim Crow South was out of the way, by the time I came along through schools, the remnants of the past were still there. A brief example is my high school, which was public, majority Black, was across the street, seriously, around the corner from a private, predominantly white academy. So thinking about being in rural Alabama and seeing the remnants of the past, I'd always had in the back of my mind questions about past educational leaders and their decisions and how they shape the present. And so not that I was thinking critically about that as a teenager, but by no means, but it always had been in the back of my mind. So by the time I started to formally study educational history, I wanted to know more about leaders, particularly during the Black freedom struggle. And then as I actually got the book research process off the ground, you get into the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, 2012, yeah. The Black student protests at the University of Missouri and so forth in 2015. It really just came together that as we looked at college presidents on college campuses, we were asking the same questions that were mindful to me when I was a kid growing up. So the origins, the inspiration for this book go all the way back to Bowling, Alabama, but a lot of contemporary issues also shape how I made sense of the past, for sure.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to add a question here, if that's okay with you. The amount of archival data, we were just talking about the archives and how they're closed, but the amount of archival data that you use, these primary documents, the different locations that you had to travel to, can you give us just a little bit of that story as well? Because it's truly impressive how much you must have now in your own personal collection from gathering all these sources from different places.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's probably one of my favorite questions about the process of writing the book. So as mentioned in the introduction, I had a fellowship from the Spencer Foundation, National Academy of Education. Then back to back, with the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. And so I ended up going to nearly 30 different universities, colleges and universities across America, doing archival research. So starting in North Carolina, then coming down to Georgia, doing both historically Black colleges and predominantly white institutions. Went to Nashville, Tennessee. From there, I went to Syracuse, New York. Syracuse, I flew across to Madison, Wisconsin. From Madison to Ann Arbor, Michigan. And then I came down to Baltimore in the mid-Atlantic, took the train from Baltimore to Philly. So you're talking about in Philly doing Temple and UPenn, then came down to Austin, Texas. Then I took a flight out to the West Coast, the Bay Area. It was December. I remember just blown away because it was winter everywhere else, but just loving being in California. So December research, timing it perfectly.
Yeah.
Then came down, where we are in LA, SC, UCLA. Then I went back down south and did, across Mississippi, brief stop in Memphis, did the University of Alabama. Then I went up to Chicago and wrapped up the broader piece of the work at Princeton out on the East Coast. So ended up being, again, nearly 30 colleges and universities, so many different presidents, looking at a 20-year time period. But ultimately, I want to tell a national story of the college presidency, right? And the Black freedom movement as seen through their actions, including private and public institutions, historically Black, predominantly white, and Southern and non-Southern institutions. So it was absolutely a lot of traveling, a lot of hotels, but well worth it in the end.
Okay. Well, then it begs the question, how many miles have you racked up now?
I had a nice airline status up to the pandemic. Yes.
All right. I'm gonna get into chapter 1. I really truly enjoyed this chapter because your biography of Martin D. Jenkins. Chapter 1 introduces the reader to Martin D. Jenkins, a prolific scholar and activist who assumed the presidency at Morgan State College in 1948. At a very young age, I don't remember exactly what age, but I know he was young.
Yeah.
Can you speak to some of his unique challenges as president and as a desegregation activist in the broader community? For example, you write that he regretfully rescinded a speaking invitation to W.E. Du Bois.
Yeah. No, Martin Jenkins is a fascinating figure. And he became the president of Morgan State at age 43. He was born in 1904. So he was quite young and having a prolific career. So a little bit of background, his education follows a pretty common trajectory for Black scholars during this time period, right? He's educated at a historically Black college undergrad. He goes to Howard, but then he goes on and does his graduate work, his master's and PhD at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And he goes on to have a phenomenal career as a scholar, publishing under his mentor, his faculty advisor, Paul Whitty, who's his white scholar at Northwestern, who studies gifted education. And Martin Jenkins ends up studying Black students in gifted education. And he does a ton of research nationally, but he also does his HBCU survey research. And he ends up publishing across, both predominantly white journals, venues, if you think about it. So his audience, imagine it, right? The Journal of Higher Education, right? UCLA folks should know that through our colleague Mitch Chang, being the editor of that now, but also School and Society. He publishes in the Journal of Psychology, but he also publishes in Black-run venues as well. The Crisis Magazine for the NAACP. Mm-hmm. Or the Journal of Negro Education as well. And so he's operating as a scholar in both these worlds and consulting Southern states and cities in the process. And so he ends up being a consultant for the state of Maryland when they're trying to figure out what's going on with higher education in that state because of his survey research, surveying Black colleges across the South. And he eventually gets tapped to become president of Morgan State while he's a professor back at his alma mater, Howard University. So he's truly interesting background. But when he becomes president, he has such unique challenges, as you just mentioned, right? One thing, Morgan State is a public institution now, but it was founded as a private college. And so in 1939, it shifts from being private to the state of Maryland actually purchasing Morgan State and making it a state-supported institution, because Maryland, of all states, of all Southern states, ends up being the last Southern state to provide a state-funded option for its Black residents for higher education. So that's how Morgan State ends up being public. So in the process, Morgan State has to fight to maintain its own board of trustees. Joy Williamson Lott, phenomenal historian at University of Washington, she talks about this a lot in the sense that in the Deep South is one board of trustees for all colleges and universities, including the Black colleges. But when you get in the Upper South, you get into like Maryland and other places, these individual colleges have their own board. So he's also in a unique fight to maintain Black control of Black institutions, which is critical aspect of the book. And then it comes down to, because he's fighting to maintain control of Morgan State, he does eventually rescind a speaking invitation to W.B. Du Bois in 1949, who's supposed to be a commencement speaker, but he's stuck between the natural, the rock and the hard place, if you will, to where he's trying to appease the white leadership in the state who control the budget and whether Morgan can maintain his own board of trustees and so forth, alongside Du Bois, who just appeared in Paris in support of Paul Robeson at the time, and and got labeled a communist and all those sort of things, right? So it ends up in this dance, knowing that Du Bois is personally an inspiration of his.
Right.
So you see throughout the book these personal conflicts with these presidents between who they are as the president and who they are personally as well. So Martin Jenkins is just a fascinating figure to come across.
Yeah, I really appreciate that distinction that you make. Who are they in their role as president, and who are they, themselves? Like, how do they feel about civil rights? In his inaugural address, he said he was going to address the issue of segregation. So, but yet he's limited, right? At the same time, he's trying to grow the college. He's trying to acquire that land at Morgan State to expand it, which he does eventually. But it takes this navigating and this negotiating, right, back and forth, because he has to deal with the governor. So I really appreciate that distinction, that we get to learn of the presidents themselves personally, but also their role that they're playing, juggling all these different issues. I'm gonna move on to the next one, which I think it's a good lead in. Was there a difference in how Black and white college presidents responded to the same issues? And how does time and place affect what they were able to accomplish? When I read your book, I could see that there were some natural breaks, some events. One is prior to Brown v. Board, and then after and during World War II, and then at the height of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I wonder if you can speak to that time and place, but also how was it for Black presidents versus white presidents that were trying to move the civil rights agenda forward?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I appreciate you picking up on the time periods, the significant turning points along the way. So pre-Brown, let's talk about the white college presidents pre-Brown. It's important to note that they were well aware of segregation and the challenges to segregation well before Brown. And that's something that I really put a lot of effort into in the book. Not that they were trying to prepare for it, but they certainly knew it was coming, if you will, right? You think about these major court cases, right? 1936, Maryland itself has Pearson versus Murray, the University of Maryland Law School pushed to desegregate. 1936, also the Gaines case at the University of Missouri. In the Upper South, you see these court cases ruling in favor of forcing these all-white Southern universities to desegregate at least their graduate and professional programs at the time. So you see these presidents are well aware of it, and they're communicating with each other. That's a benefit of going to so many different universities. You see the opposite end of communication, what was being said internally and between institutions at the time. So that's notable. But post Brown, all of a sudden there's more conversation among these white college presidents about the how. It isn't as much of a surprise to them post Brown, in the sense that when we think of white resistance, anti-Blackness, actual violent resistance to desegregating schools, these white presidents are not shocked the way the general public tends to be, because they've been dealing with it for quite some time. I think that's so intriguing to really get into that aspect of the book, to see how people see change coming and how they're preparing for it, even though they're not publicly saying it. But then the Black presidents, pre-Brown, they're methodical, these Black college presidents, and how they're engaging the fight to challenge segregation in the South. Before Brown, I mean, they're so convert. I mean, these private meetings, these quiet meetings they have with each other, using teacher association meetings as a shield to really plot among themselves. It's so strategic. But then post Brown, I love the fact that someone like Martin Jenkins and other presidents, they're so realistic in their appraisal of the Brown decision, right? They're not overly jubilant like change is going to happen. Martin Jenkins in December 53 has a speech where he says, we expect the Brown decision to be ruled in our favor, but change isn't going to come immediately. I think that's so intriguing to watch the difference, see how these presidents move between each other, between white presidents and black presidents, with all their eyes on the same institution, on the same decision in the courts. But then you get post-Brown even further, and the white college presidents outside of the South, I think they're probably the ones that are most out of touch with what's really going on, because they're looking at race like a Southern issue, when in reality, there's just as much racism on these campuses, be it Princeton, University of Michigan, University of Wisconsin, us at UCLA. Regardless, those same issues are there, but they're looking at the South as if that issue is not their own issue. So great question, picking up on that. Thank you.
Sure. Let's move on to the media. I'm very interested in it. I know you did a lot of archival work in terms of the newspapers, and I'm wondering, what role did the media play in covering the actions of the presidents, and in particular, the difference between the black press and the mainstream press, but also how did the presidents use the media themselves? And both of them.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that. The black press and white and mainstream press, let me say that. That's just fascinating, just how a college president could talk about the same issue to a different publisher completely differently. Robert Hutchins, University of Chicago, is an excellent example in the 1930s going into the 40s, in the sense that the Chicago Defender was calling out the University of Chicago for perpetuating, racial restrictive covenants and housing discrimination in Chicago. How Hutchins engages the Chicago Defender is very sympathetic. I understand the issues. We are a very diverse institution. We're going to do better, right? But at the same time, turns over and looks at the Chicago Daily News and says, we've got to address the slum issue. We're going to, this is it's like night and day. In a lot of ways, it feels like if you were to watch CNN today and then immediately jump over to Fox News, right? It's almost as if you're looking at two different countries. Right. To what the main issues were. So these presidents are quite savvy, and the black college presidents in particular are savvy because mainstream media also paid a lot of attention to black college campuses and asked a lot of questions of black presidents, but they were very cautious in how much they said. I think that is one of the most fascinating aspects of the book, that is almost a chess game going on, using the media as a way to be very cautious and proceed with care around a broader black freedom struggle when you're talking to mainstream press, but knowing that something like the black newspapers, like the Baltimore Afro-American or the Chicago Defender, are very much having a different conversation. So the media is very influential, and presidents knew that historically, and I would argue today.
Yeah. And I think along those lines is also what they said in public, but what they said in private. I know you get into a little bit some of that, like behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, how black presidents created a network among themselves. Those were very different conversations that they were having with their white counterparts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think about as these different networks, be it fraternal and sorority networks, church and religious networks, academic association networks, even black media networks, right? There are many times when college presidents are in meetings with the publishers of these major black newspapers. And so knowing that, the Pittsburgh Courier is in conversation with the president of Howard University, that's no coincidence, right? And so the message can be, the conversation they have privately can also be tailored and put into the black press in a way that doesn't trigger the white mainstream audience in a way that black people can still communicate among themselves and their networks. Probably one of the hardest part of the research to pull out, but I think one of the most fruitful aspects of the book was that, for sure.
Well, I'm going to bring it closer to home. For those of us, especially at the UCLA campus, I'm sure would like to know about our Chancellor, Franklin D. Murphy.
Mm.
UCLA was a supporter of students on campus in civil rights organizations such as the NAACP. Was he unique in his support, and how did he change the campus? Was this a turning point for the UCLA campus? It seems like it was.
Yeah.
I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah, Franklin Murphy, Franklin D. Murphy, who now has the sculpture garden named after him on campus now, right? Absolutely turning point in the history of UCLA was his hire. And what's really interesting, what I try to lay out in the book, is he was hesitant about taking the UCLA job. Previously, he was chancellor at the University of Kansas, and he was unique in his support of students, particularly Black students, particularly in his efforts to end discrimination both on campus and in Westwood. He was unique within on the UCLA campus, not just among college presidents nationally. He was, because the NAACP for 5 or 6 years had been trying to become a recognized student organization at UCLA. Mm-hmm. And conservative administrators before Murphy would not have it. I mean, the UC system was not having student groups that were engaged with social issues. It was not going to happen. I mean, this eventually bubbled up probably on the biggest level with the free speech movement up at Berkeley in '64, and that administrators for decades tried to keep students from engaging these social issues under the banner of the University of California. So Franklin Murphy comes in and completely shakes everything up. He immediately recognizes the NAACP as a student organization, which gives him access to university resources to support the civil rights movement. And in turn, his broader push for supporting the Black freedom movement really put a lot of UCLA students, gave them the leeway to go down south for the freedom rides in summer '61, got arrested, and he actually went into his pocket and personally gave some funds that helped those students with their bail, afford bail when they were arrested in Mississippi. So hands down, Franklin Murphy, both the academic and social trajectory of UCLA changes to what we likely know today with his hire.
And he was forced to, or he volunteered to put up his own money for the bail for those the UCLA freedom riders, because I believe the board voted in a 5-3 to not post bail.
Yeah.
And the other thing that he does is one, the president of the UC, Clark Kerr, not allow for student organizations to exist on campus. That's the other thing that he changes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So Clark Kerr is, I mean, as conservative as you can imagine, leading the UC system, president up at Berkeley, and he really, in so many ways, attempts to micromanage Franklin Murphy. Franklin Murphy just happens to have the personality that was combative and pushed back on Clark Kerr. One of Franklin Murphy's most funniest things that I try to lay out in the book is not only is he upset at Clark Kerr for micromanagement as system president, he's also upset at the chancellors of other UC campuses for allowing Clark Kerr for so long to micromanage them. And so he's got this dominant philosophy that if UCLA is truly going to become the university it should be and can be, it's going to have to come from under the thumb of Berkeley. And so thinking about the UC system today and how things are structured, without a doubt, Franklin Murphy is a fascinating figure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to start making some connections between the past and the present, and also related to UCLA. As you know, we have Prop 16 on the November ballot regarding affirmative action. This will have an obvious impact on higher education. And since you closed the book talking about the origins of affirmative action on college campuses, can you tell us about the role that college presidents played in shaping this policy that still impacts us today?
Absolutely. So here's the deal with affirmative action. When we think about it now in a higher education context today, we most often think about race-conscious admissions. I mean, that's the talking point, right? Can you consider race in admissions on a college campus? Right. And that debate tends to be limited to a particular number of select predominantly white institutions. That's what it comes down to. But historically, these college presidents actually shaped this policy, and it was much more broader than that. And that's where I wrap up the book talking about the origins of affirmative action in higher education. Because John F. Kennedy, in the Kennedy administration in 1963, the bloody years 1963, are under intense global pressure and not having the answers for how to address the racial issues in America. The Kennedy administration turns toward college presidents and ultimately asks them, can they come up with special programs to address America's racial problems? Oftentimes, Kennedy did not specify what those special programs were, so he just left it to college presidents. Whatever it is, come up with something to help us out. So immediately you have the presidents of Black colleges working with the presidents of white colleges, and wrapping up the book with this brings the book full circle from opening up with the Black colleges, brings it to where the presidents of Black and white institutions are in the room together. And they come up with these programs, these original affirmative action programs, if you will. And the majority of it actually focused on historically Black colleges. Because in 1963, 2/3 of America's 180,000 Black college students attend Black colleges, HBCUs at the time, right? And so most programs are focused on, giving additional graduate training to Black colleges, cultural exchange programs, partnerships between the wealthier, more resourced white colleges, Michigan's, Wisconsin's, UCLA's, those kind of places, making partnerships with Black colleges down south. And those programs are on their way, they're rolling, they're getting some media attention. And then eventually the white presidents on these white campuses really co-op these programs and make it really about themselves. The University of Wisconsin is an example to where they've got a partnership with Texas Southern in Houston, North Carolina Central in Durham, North Carolina A&T in Greensboro. And they turn their attention toward actually trying to poach Black talent from these Black campuses or white campuses. I think with hands down, that's one of the most fascinating aspects of the book, because we see a moment where briefly American higher education was committed to system-wide change. And it was dismantled to where it really just benefited the wealthier institutions. And so even today, when we think about affirmative action in higher education, I can't help but think about what could have been and how we're having the most narrow form of debate right now today, focusing on a handful of institutions, when in reality, we should have been talking about system-wide change in higher education.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eddie. Connecting the past to the present, again, what are some of the lessons of the past that we can learn from? And what do you hope current college presidents and administrators would learn from reading your book?
Yeah, a couple lessons for the readership and general public. One, higher education plays an outsized role in society. Just to look at that affirmative action example that I just gave again, when we think about colleges and universities, when we have societal problems, we often look to these institutions to help us solve these societal problems. In turn, college presidents have a huge amount of influence because they lead the institutions that are expected to help solve societal problems. So one lesson is to think differently about the role of the college and university in society and what we can come to expect of the academic leaders. And then broader, if you're reading this book, you can't, any racial issue, both on campus and beyond, this book gives you some insight into it, right? Whether you're talking about housing discrimination, residential housing policy, whether you're talking about free speech, whether you're talking about who can and can't go to certain colleges, what are we talking about right now, police brutality and the role of law enforcement in this relationship to colleges and universities. All these issues are grappled with from a historical perspective. And so thinking about the role of our academic leaders and their influence, and that oftentimes their influence reaches well beyond the role of their position, and they have far more sway. They aren't always just limited to the board of trustees, which we often lend to say they don't. I mean, the book lays out a number of examples where presidents stand up to their board and say, no, this is what we're going to do. And the board, if they see that president as a valuable leader, goes along with it. So that's one lesson for the general readership. Yeah. But a couple of things for college presidents in general, I got to say one thing, listen, That seems so simple, but there's so many times that we see historically, and we see it even more so today, where academic leaders are preparing their public statement in response to an issue before actually hearing the issue and actually listening to the issue that the students or community organizers are bringing forth with the university. So listening is absolutely critical, and you'll see why it's valuable to listen if you're a college president reading my book. And then the second thing is, I would invite any college president to know their university's history. I think that hands down, they should have a standing meeting with their university archivists in a way that not just a one-time go over, spend 30 minutes, but like just have a continuous meeting, just like they do with other members of their cabinet. I always want to touch base with university history and fully understand the decisions made before them, right? Presidents tend to know the general history of the university, but not get so much into the individual actions of the president's office beforehand, and then go beyond the university archives, because the real history is in the streets and understanding how your university has interacted with its broader community in the past. So read the local Black newspaper if that's applicable to your campus community, get into your local historical archives, and then put that whole picture together between the record that the university kept and what the community kept, so you can truly understand what your university is doing. So hands down, those are my lessons. But David, you know, as you're asking me to think about lessons of the past, I think this is a great point to make some clear connections to your work. Can you give me a brief overview of your book? And in particular, I just got to know what you uncovered about educational leaders, because I'm interested in leadership in Oxnard and Ventura County, enacting segregation policies. And what do you hope current educational leaders on the K-12 level would learn from reading your book?
Well, thank you, Eddie. I appreciate that dialogue. And I just want to remind the audience that today's focus is on Eddie's book. It's hot off the press, but I appreciate the question to at least briefly introduce you to my book, Strategies of Segregation, Race, Residence, and the Struggle for Educational Equality. So my book is more of a community, it's an educational history of Oxnard, California. For those of you that may not be familiar where that is, we're about 60 miles north of Los Angeles in Ventura County. Oxnard continues to this day to be a very rural community. It's what Carrie McWilliams called a urban community. It's some places are still very rural because we have a lot of agriculture, but then it's 200,000 people that are living here. So what I did is, this is a community that I grew up, so I'm very close to this research. I attended many of the schools that I write about, and I was interested in uncovering what were the experiences of students of color since the city's incorporation in 1903. And what I found as I was digging through the archives and the school board minutes is that the power brokers, the educational leaders, the superintendent, the school board established at least 4 strategies of segregation because in Oxnard, it was not a question of whether to segregate Mexican children and later African-American children. It was a question of how to do so effectively. So one of the main arguments and why the title of the book is Strategies of Segregation is because I identified at least 4. And the first is they established a racial hierarchy. Now that's common in other places. Obviously, whites were at the top of that. Mexicans were at the bottom of that. The second strategy is that they build a permanent link between residential and school segregation. Often we talk about those as separate, and in Oxnard, they were really interconnected. The third one is that they utilize the school within a school model of segregation. If you know some of the segregation experiences of Mexican American students, what you would normally find in the Southwest is that Mexican children were segregated in a separate building within their own school. In Oxnard, however, up until 1939, there was only 3 schools. So they had a problem of a lack of schools to separate all the Mexican children into one building, in part because Mexican children outnumber the white students 2 to 1, 3 to 1. depending on the time. So they were incapable of doing that, and that's one of the unique things that I found about Oxnard, that they had this school within the school within a school model of segregation. So what you see on the cover of the book, as an example, this is a shack, but the Mexican children knew that they were on the same grounds, but they were in this shack put in the back, and that's how they segregated them still within the campus. And finally, what I call the white architects, and I'm building here on William Watkins' work, the white architect of Mexican American education, using that term that he defined, is that there was no rationale for segregating them. They purposely kept it off the record. And so these strategies were used at the same time, or in the, I'm missing the word. They were used, employed at the same time or separately, but they were all aimed to keep Mexican children undereducated and eventually encourage them to drop out and work in the fields, which is the main goal that they had here for them. And they were unfortunately very successful at doing that. So that the book then ends with the Soria v. Oxnard School District desegregation case, which is filed in 1970. It is filed jointly by Mexican American and African American students, or in a class action lawsuit. And they what I like is that the NAACP and the Community Service Organization came together to file that lawsuit against the district. And in 1974, Judge Pregerson hands down his decision and orders the school district to desegregate. So in a nutshell, as quick as I could put it, that's what the book is about.
No, I love that. Thanks for sharing that, David. I think that's important for us to hear that, because I'm just so happy to be in conversation with you, and your work is just phenomenal in that regard. And I love the fact that you made the contemporary connection, talking about how your book wraps up and the role of cross-racial coalitions. That just gives me a lot of hope. And I hope everyone, if they don't already have your book, absolutely go get a copy right now. But let me just say another thing that gives me hope. And I want us to get a chance to talk to the audience as well at this point. Your book has that like real-time impact, right? So let's talk about it, right? Because all the time I think of history, it's like, oh, that's cool. But no, history, is real. So can you speak, I want you to just tell us, can you speak a little bit about how some sixth graders responded to learning about Oxnard's first mayor and school superintendent, let me make sure I got the name, Richard B. Haydock, who their school was named after. And I want to put emphasis on the word was named after. Tell us about your book and these sixth graders. What just happened?
Thank you. So the story goes in September of 2018, I received an email from a sixth grade teacher at Haydock Middle School, which is a school that I actually graduated from. Who said that some of her students were asking her, who's our school named after? Who's Richard B. Haydock? I'm trying to make this, short. She said, so I didn't know, but I said, why don't you come in at lunch and we'll do a little research and we'll figure it out. Well, they came across my book, long story short, and they started reading. So Richard B. Haydock was Oxnard's first mayor and then became superintendent of elementary schools up until from 1903 to 1939. And he said of a lot of very racist things because he was trying to justify the segregation of Mexican children. I'll very quickly read how he viewed Mexican families. And he said, the ignorant are allowed to live and breed under conditions that become a threat and a menace to the welfare of the community. We suggest to these Mexican people that they care for themselves, but they do nothing. The personal health of the Mexican children in the grammar school affects every child in the school. So he was basically saying that they have contagious diseases and they're going to, and so this is what he had to promote this lie
Yep.
so that to justify the segregation of Mexican children. Well, these two sixth grade students, Kimberly and Desiree, uh, became angered by this and frustrated, and they asked, "Why are we commemorating our school with this racist man's name?" So they organized themselves, sixth graders. Now, when you think about an academic book, you're not thinking that a sixth grader is going to pick it up and be reading through it, but they did, and they pulled quotes from it, and they wrote to the current superintendent of schools. They came before the board and they did a presentation. They read quotes from the book, and they convinced the school board to begin the process of changing the name of their school in a unanimous vote that night. Fast forward to 2020, they just put up the new sign with the new name. They named it after the first Mexican American mayor in Oxnard, Dr. Manuel M. Lopez. And this, to me, is more is it's a unique recognition. It's very humbling to me to have these young students read something and then put that into action. So that is a huge honor, and I'm very humbled by that. So I wanted to share that. I don't know if they're on there watching, but good luck, good work.
I don't know. That's great work. I love to see it, and it really just speaks to how history can truly inform and shape our understanding of the present, hands down. Let me turn it over back to toward audience questions at this point.
Okay.
All right, so I'll man the Q&A box. Maybe I'll give it a shot, David. What you think?
Okay.
So one question is: are there college leaders today that you, me, think are addressing the calls for racial equity and justice adequately? That's a great question around college leaders at the moment. Who's doing it well, basically, particularly in this pandemic. I have to say that I've been impressed by overall, I would say, a number of historically Black college and university presidents, knowing that how the coronavirus is disproportionately impacting communities of color, just to be frank, and just how dangerous that is. Those campuses are in a unique position to where they're both committed to educating people from a variety of backgrounds, but also the safety aspect of it too. And knowing what we know from history, how these institutions are historically underfunded, I'm sure they would love to have people on campus, packed residence halls, taking classes face-to-face, having big sporting events. But I think that stands out for me in particular, that they've sort of put forth the well-being around race and their students and their broader community before the institution. So that stands out to me in particular. But as far as predominantly white institutions, I'm intrigued. I see potential in a lot of places, but an argument that I made in the LA Times op-ed back in July this summer is that it's one thing to make these long overdue decisions around renaming university buildings and those sort of things after known racists. You think about Woodrow Wilson at Princeton as an example, but I'm waiting to see the actual operational changes on campus. Right? It's one thing to say we're going to release a statement that says Black Lives Matter. It's another thing to actually earmark funds and put to actually put the university budget behind showing just how Black Lives Matter and so forth. So it remains to be seen, but there's a lot to be had, a lot of conversations to be had around who's doing it well, who's not doing it well, and college sports is part of that too. Who gets to play sports in the pandemic, and sports that are disproportionately, filled by teams that are Black and brown students during the pandemic. So what does that mean for as far as doing it well? So great question. Let's see, what others do we have? Someone asked, can I expand on how gentrification plays a part in housing discrimination on college campuses? That's another great question, timely question. Ultimately, what I discuss in the book is how colleges have, during the post World War II, they expand both in enrollment and they physically expand, and therefore they displace long-standing Black neighborhoods that are near campuses. This happens in Philadelphia. This happens in the Boston, Cambridge area, Chicago. I mean, you pick a major U.S. city. This likely happens where there's a major university. Baylor University down in Waco, Texas, is involved in these college presidents getting together and lobbying to federal officials for millions of dollars to be poured into higher education, that in turn these universities use to buy property and displace households. Knowing that history and knowing the role of college presidents in shaping federal housing policies, that lends a lot of questions toward the present moment right now, to think about what does it mean for an institution to continue to expand and build new buildings and take over entire city blocks. We can go on and on about that, but it's happening. I mean, historically in more urban, larger cities, but now we're seeing it happen in more rural, smaller towns, right? Clemson University in, South Carolina is a perfect example to where longstanding rural Black communities are being displaced by this land grant university that is expanding its footprint. So we're still seeing the same thing, right? We all of a sudden think about amenities for students in terms of new pizza parlors and bars and apartments that cater toward a growing student clientele. But what does that mean for the community that has always been there, and particularly staff, the people who have for generations particularly worked at these universities, who can no longer afford to live in the homes that they lived in for so long while struggling with the low wages that universities have paid them for so long. So that's just another example of how that's unfolding.
Okay, can I add a little to that, Eddie?
Yeah, please do, David, please.
So in Oxnard, talking about what we had racial covenants, just like other places. So the creation of La Colonia west of the east of the railroad tracks, that the railroad tracks often become that color line that Du Bois talked about, right? We often think of the railroad tracks in historical work as a sign of advancement, right? Progress. But for communities of color, it actually is the color line.
Yeah.
And it's no different in Oxnard, where people of color, and in particularly Mexicans and African Americans after World War II, are denied access to buying homes outside of the segregated colonia. So even if they had the money, which a lot of them did, they could not move west of the tracks. And there were specific covenants that said you cannot even rent or sell to a person of color. And I noticed in one of them said, or any lineal descendant of a Mexican. So it didn't matter if you were born in the United States, you were not going to be permitted to buy that house. And what I discovered is that there was school board members, principals, teachers, all had that on their homes. So you can't tell me that they don't bring that segregationist attitude into the classroom as they're teaching these children as well. So that's how I find that interconnection. And finally, I'll just make this really quick point. What that denies us in these communities is the accumulation of wealth. You are denied to buy that home, to build equity, which someday could be passed on to your children or used to take out a loan to fund your children's education. And that's something that communities of color are denied historically, and it was very consistent up into the late 1960s and early 70s.
Now, I love that point, David. I don't love the situation, the historical fact about it, but I love the point that you bring that up, right? Because it just reminds us of how our institutions of education, be it K-12 or higher education, have perpetuated racism in so many different ways. And housing is just one way that our colleges and universities, or even our elementary and high schools, have done the same thing throughout time, right? So one thing I talk about often with my book is that I don't talk about what UCLA as an institution did. I talk about individuals who were leading these institutions, like you just mentioned, principals, superintendents, and so forth. These are individual decisions. These are people who made these decisions, right? We can't let the institution get the blame and these individuals go on their merry way, if you will. So, I mean, that's such a critical point to bring up, in that education, I mean, no different than, other entities in society have really bought into the usual capitalistic, racist mindset, and they perpetuate that. So imagine what's happening in classrooms. If you got no regard for people and where they live, you certainly don't have any regard for how they learn, for sure. I see a comment saying we've got 2 more questions, and let me try to speed to them. One being, what has changed for student activists and their struggles for freedom of speech on campuses since 50 to 60 years ago? Great question about free speech, also discussed in my book, looking at college presidents and their role in free speech as well. I think, presidents have a key role in that, but something that I like to always emphasize is that student activists, I always say, have been extremely generous to academic leaders, in the sense that they make their demands and concerns known in very formal ways at first. They don't get upset about something and immediately take over the administration building. It's usually when administrators don't act on issues immediately that student activists feel the need and press to take more notable actions to gain attention from college presidents and other senior administrators. So what I would say for activists, they've been straightforward about it, and the model is laid out for an effective way to get attention and get change, accomplished on campus. For presidents, it's one, here's the takeaway from the book, what we see historically, what has to happen today. It's one thing to condemn a controversial speaker or condemn racist speech on campus. It's another thing to actually implement policies and practices that almost make it to the point to where a racist speaker doesn't want to come on that campus, right? And so I give an example in the book to where, a president condemns a racist speaker, but at the same time immediately launches initiatives and programs on campus that address the issues that not only condemn that speaker, but shows how the university does not adhere to the things that said racist speaker was perpetuating. And so, I mean, that's applicable to, I'm sure Dave would agree, that's applicable to K-12 or higher education, in the sense that when it comes to speech, when it comes to whose voice matters on campus, when it comes to truly creating an inclusive environment, it's got to be about action afterwards. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do it.
Good point.
Yeah. And then one final question, just be mindful of time and to follow instructions. It was, how has the rise in chief diversity officers on campus changed or not changed the way college presidents address campus racism? Great question. It's always been my opinion that the college president or, the superintendent or principal sets the tone for it all, right? Regardless of whether that's somebody's day-to-day job as a diversity officer. Too often we see, presidents defer to a chief diversity officer, when in reality, it should be a statement in partnership with the chief diversity officer. And that chief diversity officer needs resources, needs to be empowered to make change, not just make public statements and not just go meet with the angered students first. But again, it comes down to being able to do the work. So even though that may have changed the nature that the organization hierarchy having a chief diversity officer, it still comes down to the college president, because they sit on too many federal commissions, too many state level committees, has too many, corporate boards, too much influence for the answers to race and racism on college campuses or in our schools to come down to, the chief diversity officer. It's really about those individual leaders, I would say. So ultimately, if you get our books, you can really grapple with all of these issues. It's just been a pleasure being in conversation with David about this tonight. Any other thoughts, David?
No, thank you for the dialogue, the invitation. I really enjoyed it. I wish we had more time and to get through a couple more questions, but thank you all for logging in today.
You're on mute. You're still muted. Oh, I still don't hear you. Here you go. I think you're there. Do you hear, David?
No, I can't.
Okay. All right. Okay. Oh, I see the note that says the mic doesn't seem to work, so we can wrap this up together, David. Since we, look.
If you don't have it yet, make sure to get it.
Hey, David, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you to 140 people.
All right.
Who registered and logged on. So that's a great turnout. I hope the conversation was real. Thank you, each of you, so much. It means a lot for you to be here, but also just a rich conversation about history, its impact on our present, and just how hopefully to the students out there, we got some more aspiring educational historians coming our way.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Okay.